Hey Wellness Warriors, welcome to the Wellness Revolution. In today's episode, we're talking about burnout and your hormones, the hidden connections that destroy your metabolism. And of course, 5 amazing tips that will help you to keep your hormones balanced, harmonized, and help you live a vital and happy life. So we all are understanding the connections between stress and burnout, and increasingly major institutions are releasing studies to show that even chronic diseases are due to stress. And in my opinion, I believe that once we've done an adequate amount of research, we're going to see that what we are calling burnout now is in fact the physical result of too much stress over too long a period of time that is left unbalanced and silently destroying metabolism, that then leads to these chronic diseases that we're beginning to identify are caused by stress. And so this is why I believe that burnout is not just a workplace situation. I say that every week, and I think it bears repeating. We place too much of an emphasis on burnout as something that happens to us when we go to work. Burnout, again, is something that is within each and every one of us wherever we go. And so if we're not taking care of burnout from the inside out, we're just going to let it spill into the workplace. We're going to let it spill into our family relationships, our friendships, our other work-related or networking relationships that we have in any number of interactions throughout our day. And so making sure that we understand the hormonal connections are so critical. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some tips about what to do to protect your hormone balance. Hormones are so important. That we talk about nutrition a lot on the podcast. We talk about making sure you have the right vitamins and minerals and proteins and fats. We talk about breathing a whole bunch on this podcast because they're all critically important. But what provides the blueprint or the recipe or the instruction manual or the code, if you will, to make sure that the body can use all of those nutrients and oxygen to do the things that we need to do and to translate into the body functions that we require are your hormones. And so if those are not in balance, then we can't use the nutrition and the oxygen to give us the end result of the body functions that we're looking for. And so hormones are essentially that. They are a recipe, they are a blueprint, they're an instruction manual, they're the code. And the body then has to read the hormone, literally like it's a recipe or a blueprint or a code. And that's literally what the body does. It reads that hormone to know, okay, I need to do this, I need to take this and put it over there, I need to add these two things together to equal this other thing, and then that way I can do my body function, right? And those hormones are critical because your body interprets them very literally, and that's really critical to know. So part of our body function is in fact making these hormones. It's easy to see how interdependent the body is, right? If you don't have the building blocks of the hormones, which are proteins, so if you don't have the vitamins, the minerals, the amino acids to build and make the hormones, then you don't have the hormones to instruct the body, right? So just like if we were wanting to follow a recipe, right, we have to have a piece of paper, or the internet has to be there, the web page has to be there, somebody has to have written the code that you can then see on the page that you're looking at the recipe on to follow the instructions, right? If someone didn't do that, there would be no recipe for us to follow. Or back in the day when it was grandma telling you the recipe verbally and you were writing it down on a piece of paper, right? Whatever the method was, something had to be done before you had that information, right? And so it's the same in the body. Something has to be done where the body makes the hormone, and then it sends it out into the bloodstream and it gets distributed into all of the cells for the cells to use those hormones. Now those hormones come in and the cell reads the hormone. Then it does the work that the hormone is telling it to do. So if it's if we continue the analogy of a recipe and we're making apple pie or something, right? we have to follow all of the steps to make the apple pie. We have to know what ingredients we need, what pan we need to put the batter in, what the oven temperature needs to be, how long we need to bake it for. This is what the hormones do. They tell us all of this information so that at the end of the day we get the apple pie, right? In the body, what that translates to is at the end of the day we get the body function that hormone coded for. So for example, estrogen or estradiol has over 400 different functions that it codes for in the human body. And there are estrogen receptors pretty much on every cell all the way through the body. So hair follicles have estrogen receptors, skin cells, eye cells, liver cells, gut cells, lung cells, ovarian cells, obviously, the uterus. We recognize those things because they're more reproductive functions, but your bones have estrogen receptors, your heart cells have estrogen receptors, your muscles have estrogen receptors. And so pretty much every body function relies in some way on estrogen. Now, also thyroid. There are thyroid hormone receptors all through the body. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, the stress hormones. There are receptors pretty much all over the body for these hormones as well. Insulin, right? Every single cell in your body requires insulin in order to take in sugar, to use that sugar and to make it into fuel or to store fat, depending on what the circumstances are. Many, many different hormones are used all through the body. They tend to have slightly overlapping functions. So if you look up the functions of thyroid hormone, for example, you'll see that they overlap quite a bit with cortisol hormones or testosterone hormones, because they do overlap out of necessity, right? Because there are certain body functions that you can't just not have, right? If you have a hormone that's out, for example, and suppressed and not functioning well, there has to be other hormones that somewhat overlap those functions. Otherwise, we would drop dead, right? And so there's a lot of overlap with hormones as well, so that the body has built-in protective mechanisms, built-in backup systems, so that the body can continue to adapt and function properly. Now, when there's too much stress put on those hormones, they begin to malfunction or backfire. And that's a really critical piece to know. We often talk about hormone balance and looking at levels of hormones, but what's equally as important is to look at how are those hormones being broken down once they're used and eliminated by the body. Because if that doesn't go according to plan, those hormones get recirculated into the body. The danger with that is that they're usually altered by the time that happens. In other words, their physical structure is usually changed in some way, and that's dangerous. Again, the body literally reads those hormones. And so if an estrogen molecule, for example, has been used and now the cell sent it out into the bloodstream, goes to the liver then takes estrogen and it needs to reshape it. It needs to change its structure. It does it on purpose because it needs to change it into a form, into a physical structure that the body will then recognize as waste. And so now the body understands, oh, I need to get rid of this particular molecule. And now the estrogen in its altered form will be then urinated out of the body. It comes out in the urine through the kidneys. If the liver is not able to completely change that hormone, and now it's kind of in this in-between phase, it's not really the estrogen that was made by the ovaries or the adrenal system where estrogen is made, and it's not really in the form where the body recognizes it as waste to be eliminated, it's in some weird middle ground. Now it goes back into the cells again. And again, your cells are not capable of identifying that estrogen has been altered. And it'll do whatever that weird estrogen tells it to do. And it doesn't have to be off by a lot to cause problems, right? We see this in progesterone, for example. The artificial progesterones that are in birth control pills and in some forms of hormone replacement therapy for menopausal females are not true progesterone. They are what we call progestins. And if you compare them to natural progesterone, they look like 90% the same. And they're only about 10% off. But that 10% is enough to cause an increased risk of cancer, somewhere between 5 and 10 years of use. 5 years for hormone replacement therapy, 10 years for birth control pills. And so that little tiny bit of being off is enough to set this chain reaction off that leads to strokes and cancers in patients. And so the same thing can happen to your actual hormones that you yourself have made. If they are not quite altered in the way that they're supposed to be, and now they're floating around in your body, weird looking, toxic looking. Now the cell takes that progestin or altered progesterone in this case, and it will do exactly what it's told. It doesn't judge and say, wait, that's not, this little corner right here is not the actual recipe for apple pie. It doesn't have the ability to distinguish that. It's just going to do what it's told, right? And so you're going to get this weird tasting apple pie, or you may not even get apple pie at all, right? If the recipe is that off. And so this is what happens in the human body if the liver, if the cells are not able to detox or metabolize that hormone to be removed and eliminated from the body. And so stress is the number one reason that actually happens. When we're under stress, there are very distinct physiological reactions that happen in the human body that cause us not to be able to break our hormones down properly. And they also cause a suppression of certain hormones that we need that are really essential for us to function. So what happens when we're under stress, right? So let's say theoretically we're walking along and all of a sudden a lion is about to pounce on us, and we see it out of the corner of our eye, and suddenly we gulp air and we run as fast as we can, right? We run for shelter. Or if the lion's too close, we try to beat it off, right? So what happens during those acute reactions? First, our eye might see a glimpse and we get startled and we gulp air, and then we suddenly start to run, right? On the inside, what's happening is our brain has heard the signal of the gulp of air and instantly has released epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are the acute stress hormones. Now, stress is supposed to be acute. It's not supposed to last for more than a couple minutes, right? Because if that lion is that close, we're either going to be dead or alive within a couple of minutes, right? Either we ran for shelter and we were able to get somewhere that the lion can't get to us, or the lion got to us and game over, right? Either way, stress is short-lived in those circumstances. Now, fast forward to modern living, right? We don't have lions roaming around in the streets anymore, and so we don't have those type of immediate stressors. Now we have work deadlines, we have maybe a sick child, we have traffic. If you're driving around in New York City, that's a stressor, right? You're stuck on a bridge somewhere, or the train's running late, or the bus is running late, or you're going to be late for work, whatever the case may be. Sometimes there's family stress, sometimes there's financial stress. So all of these things are still interpreted by your brain as though they're a lion. Like your brain actually doesn't know the difference. And we're starting to see that more and more and more in studies. Like the brain can't tell fiction from reality. And there have been many, many studies now to show that we have the same emotional and physical responses, whether we're watching a movie that's stressful or whether we're actually experiencing it in real life. Your brain thinks it's you in the movie experiencing the stress. And many studies have been done now to show that the brain can't really tell these things apart. There are other studies that show that performance athletes, for example, that visualize their game. They visualize their competition. They visualize themselves performing at top level and winning a competition. They tend to win competitions more than athletes that don't do that, right? Sports psychology, it's a well-known thing. People that want to learn how to play the piano, they learn better if they visualize themselves playing the piano. And in fact, they have the same results as people who physically practice playing the piano. And so we understand very clearly now that the brain doesn't know fiction from reality. It interprets it all the same. And so if we apply this to stress, we can easily begin to see why stress makes us sick, why stress drives our hormones out of balance, why stress caves in our metabolism eventually, if we don't do something at the brain level to convince the brain that it's safe. And we'll talk about those tips a little bit later on in the podcast. But back to hormones, right? So now you've got the epinephrine, the norepinephrine, and you've took off running, right? Now, in modern life, that's all day, every day, right? There's something chasing us in the back of our minds all day, every day. It's not a lion, but it's a deadline. It's something you need to do for your parents, your children, your colleagues, your friends, or that might be inducing a bit of stress. It's financial stress. It's any number of things. It's toxins in the air too. That's a stressor. EMF signals coming from cell phones, coming from computers, coming from television sets, things of that nature, Wi-Fi, high power lines. Those are all stressors. They're more invisible, but they are definitely still stressors to the human body. And your brain responds to them as though they are a stress or a threat because it doesn't know the difference, right? And so now, if the stress has gone on for more than a couple of minutes, your body can't continue to make norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are the acute stress hormones. So what do those acute stress hormones do? They pump out sugar into the bloodstream so that you have more energy available to your muscles to run short term. They also raise your blood pressure, raise your heart rate. They make you much more focused and alert. And they acutely raise the immune system. So the immune system is actually on high alert in acute stress. After a couple minutes, that starts to all kind of fade out of the way. So the immune system, we understand now, once there's no more epinephrine being acutely secreted, and now we have cortisol, which is the more chronic stress hormone, that will remain elevated for as long as necessary until the stressor is determined by your brain to be gone, right? So the norepinephrine, epinephrine gets replaced by cortisol after a couple of minutes. They're all still made in the same location. They're made in the adrenal glands, which are just above the kidneys. So we have two adrenal glands, one on each side of the body above the two kidneys. And the cortisol, though, has different physiological actions than the norepinephrine and the epinephrine. So once the stress becomes chronic, we get a whole different landscape in the human body. Now, cortisol also raises blood sugar because your body understands, the stress isn't gone, so I need to continue to pump out sugar so that my body can, continue to defend itself from whatever this threat is or predator is. And so blood sugar still goes up, blood pressure still goes up, heart rate still goes up. Now, there's another hormone that balances that and brings that back to normal, and that is called DHEA. And that is another hormone made in the adrenal system. And there's a delicate balance that is maintained between the cortisol and the DHEA. So we call DHEA the anti-stress or the anti-aging hormone because aging is actually a stress-related situation. So we age much more rapidly when we're under stress than when we're not under stress. And one of the reasons for that is because the DHEA can kind of catch up and clean up the mess of the cortisol. Now, if the cortisol is still going and going and going, then the DHEA can't really ever clean that up because the mess is just made all over again. I tell my clients cortisol is like a bull in a china shop, and the DHEA is kind of like the cleaning crew that comes around and cleans up after it. But if no one ever gets the bull out of the china shop, that cleaning crew is going to get, run in circles and is going to get burnt out and basically not able to keep up, right? And so this happens to the DHEA quite a bit. It's one of the very first signs that we sometimes see when we check people's hormones with saliva, is we see that their DHEA is starting to drop, even though their cortisol is still high. So the bull's still in the china shop, but the cleaning crew's kind of wiped out and laid out in the corner somewhere and not able to keep up. They've run out of cleaning supplies, they've run out of staff, and the bull's just running wild, damaging everything, right? This is the impact of chronic stress when we run out of DHEA. And the body does that kind of on purpose, right? Your body has priorities and it knows, like, all right, my cortisol is more important than my DHEA. If I can't keep both going, I'd rather let the DHEA go than the cortisol go, right? And so your body's always prioritizing in terms of immediate survival. What's the most important thing for me to do right now to be alive, right? And that is to maintain my cortisol, because that's what's going to help you fight through the stress, right? The DHA is kind of secondary to clean up the mess after the fact. But if the mess is still ongoing, then there's no point in cleaning it up, right? And so this is how the body gets damaged under stress, right? The blood sugar is high, and now we're developing insulin resistance and blood sugar dysregulation, potentially pre-diabetes. We start to see, the lack of DHEA starts to make people tired and kind of wears out their reserve tanks. And so we start to see an erosion of metabolism. Now, when that cortisol is high, another thing that happens is it suppresses your thyroid, because you can't really have both systems active at the same time because they have overlapping functions to some extent, and I'll explain that in a minute. So they both run metabolism, right? Your thyroid is a hugely important hormone to run your metabolism, but so is your cortisol. So cortisol takes over if the body is under threat, and it puts the thyroid to bed. It suppresses it. The way that it does that is by preventing the activation of the thyroid hormone. So your thyroid makes 4 different hormones. 2 of them we have no idea what they do, so we call that T1 and T2. Now T3 and T4, we do understand what they do. T4 is in response to the brain signaling. So there's a hormone called TSH that your brain produces that tells your thyroid to make T4. And so your thyroid responds by making T4. T4 is an unactive or inactive version of thyroid hormone. That T4 needs to be activated or converted into T3 in order for the thyroid hormone to actually function as a thyroid hormone. What cortisol does is it prevents the T4 from being converted to T3. And so the T3 starts to drop. Now, unfortunately, T3 is not often checked by allopathic medical doctors or mainstream medical doctors. Now, in integrative and functional medicine, we understand the importance of T3, and we do check it. And the free T3 is what really matters, because the free T3 is what's what we call bioavailable. It's what's available to be used by the cell. The total T3 is not as informative in terms of what's available for use. And so it's not as good an indicator of thyroid function as the free T3 is. Now, so people run around with under stressful conditions thinking that their thyroid is normal, even though they don't feel good, right? So I have clients like this all the time. They'll come in and say, I'm wiped out, and they keep telling me my thyroid's normal, right? And then we check their adrenal system using saliva, because that is the gold standard based on studies. So we see that they have high cortisol, or they may have normal DHEA or low DHEA even. And then when we check their free T3 and their free T4, we see that their free T4 is normal, but their free T3 is barely normal. So again, the cortisol is not going to completely shut your thyroid off, because you need your thyroid to function on some level regardless of stress, but it's not going to be optimally functioning because the adrenal system takes over and performs all of the important stress reactions because your body thinks it's under threat. So your T3 will be like, I'll often see the range is usually like 2.3 to 4.2 on a lab for a free T3. So we'll see people with a free T3 of like 2.3, 2.4, 2.5. So it's not below normal according to the reference range, but it's just sitting at the bottom. So in other words, it's got like a D minus. It's not failing. It's not going to get left back in school, but it's got a D minus, right? Nobody wants a D minus, right? Everybody wants an A plus. So you need your thyroid to be cranking on all cylinders, because your thyroid runs metabolism for all of the other systems that are not involved with stress responses. Your gastrointestinal system, your executive function, your memory storage, your skin health, your hair, your detoxification systems, right? Did I say gastrointestinal system already? But the gastrointestinal system is a huge one. Your thyroid helps to run those other systems. When cortisol is high and there's a lot of stress, those systems get suppressed because you don't need them, right? When you're running away from a lion or a tiger, whether it's for 1 minute or 10 years, right? You don't need your hair, you don't need your skin, you don't need your bones, really. You don't need, to remember things, right? You don't need to have executive function and really sharp math skills, right? You don't need those things. You don't need to detox. You don't need to digest. You don't need to urinate, right? You don't need to do those things because your body can't tell time. It thinks that it's just now all the time. So it's not going to say, hey, you know what? We've been running away from this lion now for 10 years. We should probably shut that down, right? It's never going to do that. Your body cannot tell time. And so it just keeps reinterpreting it as an acute threat over and over and over again, and releasing cortisol over and over and over again. And that's the really important thing to know about stress is what we think the body does, the body doesn't do, right? So just because we have a watch and we see the sun go up and down and it gets dark and it gets bright, our brain can't tell time. Like, it doesn't know that something has been going on for a really long time. Right? And so we have to understand that when we want to learn, like, why is my body behaving in a way that I don't want it to? It can't tell time, and it also will never shut the stress response off if it doesn't interpret itself to be safe. And it doesn't interpret itself to be safe when there are subconscious fears and threats going on within it. The good news is there are things that can be done. There are very effective things that can be done to help the subconscious mind to know itself to be safe. One of the most critical things is your breath, because it's the breath that initiates the fight or flight, right? So remember, at the top of the podcast, we said we took a big gulp of air, right? That's a shallow breath. And we're using the mouth, which is a fight or flight tool, right? So in order to let the brain know that it's safe, we have to do the opposite of that, right? We have to breathe through the nostrils and take a deep, slow breath, not an acute gulping breath through the mouth, right? So we kind of reverse engineer what got us into the mess in the first place and do the opposite, right? And so deep breathing, and you don't have to do this all day, right? It's not that you have to be a slave to how you're breathing. There are studies, really well-established studies, to show that if you simply do that for 3 minutes 3 times a day, you get this lingering impact where you kind of shut the fear responses down in the subconscious mind, and you allow the brain then to calm itself down and to be in a more relaxed state. And it's just physiology, it's just science. Like, when you take a deep breath through the nostrils and you drive air all the way down to the base of your lungs, you are triggering what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. So it's part of the autonomic or kind of automatic nervous system that controls our body temperature, controls our breathing, our heartbeat, and things of that, and opposite signals to shut it back down. And that's what's really critical. And that needs to be done on a consistent basis. So, more or less 3 times a day for 3 minutes is really critical. That's what the Institute of Heart Math has studied and shown to help the parasympathetic side of your nervous system stay dominant for up to 6 hours after you've done the last breathing episode, a breathing exercise, I should say. So first thing when you get up in the morning, you do 3 minutes of 5-second inhale, 5-second exhale through the nostrils. You do that for 3 minutes, and then sometime in the middle of the day, you do it again. And then before you go to sleep, you do it again. Each time you do it, you get this 6-hour lingering impact where you kind of get to shut the subconscious chatter in the brain that is fearful, that is continuing to propel these stress responses and to continuing to lead the adrenal system to release more cortisol, for the stress responses to be unending, essentially. Now, the danger, if you don't interrupt those stress responses and wind it back, is at some point, even the adrenal system will not be able to continue to crank out cortisol anymore. And what we start to see when we check is the DHEA is low, because the stress has been going on for too long, and now the cleaning crew has, again, is in the corner in the fetal position screaming for help, but the bull is still in the china shop. What happens is eventually the bull gets tired, right? And so we start to see that the cortisol starts to drop. So this critical hormone that your body holds on to tenaciously, can't hold on to it anymore, can't keep making it anymore. And so we start to see the cortisol drop. Very often we catch it in the normal range. And it's deceptively normal when we see that. So the telltale sign is that the DHA is low and the cortisol is normal. That's the giveaway. If your cortisol was really normal because you were handling stress very well and the system was in a calm state, you shouldn't have a low DHEA, right? Your DHA should also be normal. And so that's the giveaway. It's that the DHA is low. Now remember, you're not going to see this in blood work. It's not going to show up. The blood work is not sensitive enough to capture these things. These things are going on at the level of your cells, deep in the tissues. They're not in the bloodstream. Because again, your body knows that it needs to protect the bloodstream because it's the bloodstream that feeds the heart and the lungs, right? So it tenaciously normalizes that system, which is why we don't see these things until they've been going on for potentially decades inside of the cells, right? I see this all the time. People have normal DHEA in their bloodstream, but low DHEA in their cells. They'll have normal vitamin levels in the bloodstream, but low levels in their cells. The cells that are being shortchanged, that are not as important under stress, the hair follicles, the skin, the liver cells, the immune cells, the bone cells, the muscle cells. These cells are not as important to your body as your heart and your lungs. And so they will not get their fair share, right? In our last podcast, and probably a couple even before that, we talked about the food chain that your body puts itself on when it's running out of resources, right? So that the critical systems, heart and lung, get the resources they need at the expense of the less important systems, hair follicles, skin cells, musculoskeletal system. And so the body prioritizes, right? It prioritizes what's here in the thorax as priorities. Your heart and your lungs are right here. Second to that, it prioritizes what's in your abdomen, right? So the gastrointestinal system, the kidneys, the liver, the gallbladder, and then the pelvis also included there. So, secondary is the ovaries, secondary is the uterus, and in men it's the prostate and the testes, right? These things are kind of middle importance to your body. They're not as important as the heart and lungs for critical survival functions. They're not as unimportant as what's considered to be like the exterior of the body, the hair and the skin. So what's in here is more important than what's on the outside, right? The hair follicles, the skin cells. We don't really need those things to be alive, technically speaking, right? So this is how your body prioritizes in times of duress, if the stress is going on for too long. And so it kind of shuts down the testicular hormones, it kind of shuts down the ovarian hormones, because your body does not want to reproduce if it thinks it's under threat. So it's a mechanism of protection so that you don't expend a ton of energy reproducing and have the lion eat your young, right? Because again, your brain can't tell the difference. It doesn't know that there's no lion or bear. Even though it can see, it still interprets it very rudimentarily as if it's a lion or a bear. Like your body cannot tell the difference. And so it will protect your reproduction by stopping it, essentially. And so a lot of infertility is actually stress. It's not that there's some horrible disease going on. It's that the body does not want to reproduce because it thinks that its young will be eaten alive by whatever predator is out there. And so these are important things to know if you, again, want to reverse engineer those things. So one of the key things that I tell my clients who come in for fertility preservation is, making sure that the brain interprets itself to be safe. If it doesn't do that, you're going to automatically be shallow breathing and you won't even know that it's happening. So we shallow breathe when we're stressed out, right? And so this is almost like an unconscious function that we perform if we're not very aware of our body function, right? So self-awareness is critical. We need to know, like, how do I feel on the inside? What's happening? How am I breathing? What's my brain thinking about, right? Sometimes we have these thoughts, we have these conversations going on in our heads, and we're not even participating, right? It's like they're having their own little conversation and we're trying to get our work done or whatever the case may be, but there's this background chatter, right? It's the background chatter that's going to make you sick, right? That's what you want to focus in on and quiet down. And breath is the most effective way to do that. Meditation is another extremely effective way. They've done studies on breath work, they've done studies on meditation to show that they literally structurally change the brain and they allow the brain to function much more optimally and they allow the physiology of the body to be much more broad. And now we have really good studies on meditation to show that it actually induces structural changes in the brain that then leads to different physiology in the body. And so we understand that yes, meditation is actually very effective for restoring proper body function. Breath work is very effective for restoring proper body function. Our breath controls our heart rate variability. So heart rate variability is starting to become a vital sign, essentially, much like blood pressure and heart rate. Heart rate variability is different than your pulse. It's more or less how your heart bounces around from beat to beat. So if you put yourself on a monitor and you observe your heart rate, it's never the same number twice. It's never just going to be 70, 70, 70, 70, 70. It's going to be 70, 80, 68, 75, back and forth, up and down. How much that number varies by is the heart rate variability. So how much your heart jumps from one beat to the next beat matters. And that's a sign of agility, adaptability, and overall, health and well-being. When we're stressed out, the heart rate variability narrows because we're hyper-focused on the stressor. So if you were to put yourself on a monitor during those circumstances, you would see that the variability of your heart rate is narrow. You might be like at 90, 92, 88, 94. It would be very narrow. You wouldn't have that 20 beat differential from beat to beat. It would only be 4 or 5. That's a sign of poor health. That's a sign of low adaptability because your body is not adaptable when it thinks it's under threat, right? So it makes sense. So breathing literally changes how your heart beats. And so it's really critical to make sure that you're taking breaths periodically throughout the day that help the heart to guide the brain to know that it's safe. The electromagnetic field of the heart is actually 100 times more potent and powerful than the electromagnetic field of the brain. And we're beginning to understand that the brain doesn't actually think. It's just recalling memory and making a story out of those memories. And so it's really important for us to begin to understand, like, hey, my brain isn't quite as powerful as I thought it was. And so I need to guide it a little bit better, right? Our brain really relies on data input. It's like a receiver of information. So we need to perceive light coming into our eye in order to see. We need to wait for the sound waves to come into our ears for the brain to interpret the sound wave as a sound. So there's always this passage of time. Although it's very quick, it's still a passage of time. So the brain is always in the past, even though it's by a split second. And so it never really quite knows what's going on in the moment. And it's always a memory recall. And it will take bits of data that it's getting as information, and it will string a story, make a story out of it based on its memory bank. And so this is actually the danger, right? The brain is much better equipped to remember things that will threaten it than things that make it happy, right? Because its job is not to be happy. Its job is to stay safe. And so if we really want to do that, we have to engage the heart. The heart has to be the commander. In Chinese medicine, they taught us this. They taught us that the heart is the commander of the body. At the time, this was I guess almost, probably 20 years ago now. At the time, I didn't understand that because I learned in medical school that the brain was the commander of the body, right? Like everything is controlled by the brain. And so when I was sitting in class listening to this, I was like, what are they talking about? Like the heart just propels blood around the body. How can it command the body? Well, we found out in the 1990s exactly how it commands the body, and it is through the heart rate variability and the electromagnetic field that it propagates that's 100 times stronger than the human brain. So we're beginning to understand, like, oh, I need to actually engage my heart if I want to reduce stress. The emotion of the heart, according to Chinese medicine, is joy. And so it then can, get you into a joyful, happy place, so to speak. And that filters down into the brain and allows the brain to then receive that information as opposed to recalling threats, which is what it's really good at doing. And so breathing and thinking happy thoughts is really important. And we're going to talk about how telling stories about yourself to yourself is really key. So stick around till the end. We're going to talk about that. But moving on to hormones, right? So what happens to the rest of your hormones? So within the ovarian system for women and the testicular system for men, right? So we all make the same hormones. We all make estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone within our reproductive glands, right? So ovaries for women, testes for men. Now, the amounts of each hormone we make will vary. So men will make much more testosterone than women. Women will make much more estrogen than men. Women will make more progesterone than men. But men still need estrogen, progesterone, in addition to their testosterone for proper body function. Because again, we all, regardless of gender, have the same receptors for the same hormones in all the same tissues. And so it's important to know that stress suppresses those systems. And so you're not going to have proper body function. It's not just reproduction that's going to suffer. Those hormones are also key for a whole bunch of other body functions that have nothing whatsoever to do with reproduction. And so this is how we begin to see, again, the thyroid is suppressed. And so the gastrointestinal system's not working well. Our immune system is a critical system that gets suppressed by cortisol, gets suppressed by chronic stress. Right? So then we begin to catch colds more. We're more susceptible to viruses and bacteria and fungal infections and parasites, and we get more inflammation, right? We are more susceptible to autoimmune conditions when our immune system is suppressed and not functioning properly, right? People tend to mistakenly think that an autoimmune condition is because my immune system is overactive, and so they assume that if the immune system is suppressed, that means it'll work better. But that's not true, right? The confusion of the immune system is due to its low functioning. So your immune system really only has one function at the end of the day, and that is to recognize self from not self. So what is me? What is not me? Right? And so what is me gets to be here. What is not me gets destroyed and eliminated, right? That's the immune system's function. So if it's a parasite, not me, right? That gets to get destroyed and eliminated. But if the immune system is weakened, it's missing vitamins and minerals, or there's so much stress that it's been suppressed, it gets confused. Like it's not able to distinguish me from not me because it doesn't have the tools to perform its functions. So there's a confusion that sets in. And now it doesn't know me from not me. And it starts to attack itself and leave things that it should be attacking and destroying and eliminating. And so this is how we get infections, right? These things just come in and they hang out, and nobody's there trying to get rid of them. And then on the other hand, we're making, for example, anti-nuclear antibodies, which we recognize as ANA in our blood work that might be high. In the case of autoimmune conditions, we might see elevated rheumatoid factors. We might see anti-thyroid antibodies, where the body is literally making antibodies against itself because it's so confused from the suppression and the weakness. And so in order to correct that, we have to actually build up the immune system, not suppress it, right? Now, there's a way that we can artificially suppress it with the biologics and the drugs that are being made now for autoimmune conditions. Basically suppress the immune system so much there is no response. And that's why there's an increased risk of cancer with those drugs, because now there's no response against cancer cells developing. This is why people tend to get more infections with those drugs, because there's no response to an invader, right? People get toxic because there's no response to toxins, right? So while yes, then you're not going to attack yourself, on the one hand, you're going to then have a whole bunch of other problems to deal with on the other hand. And so it's really important to identify, like, okay, why is my immune system suppressed, right? If I have stress, I need to build up or support my adrenal system and do the things that I need to do so that my brain stops interpreting that it's under threat, so that my immune system can not be suppressed anymore. And then I might need to figure out, like, what nutrients are missing in my immune system. Do I have vitamin and mineral deficiencies that my immune system needs to function, that I need to replace so that my immune system is more robust? A robust immune system, or a strong immune system, does not attack itself because it understands self from not self. It's much more efficient at doing its job. Now, those same hormones, estrogen, thyroid, testosterone, DHEA, cortisol, they all have functions within the immune system. They all code for immune system functions. And so it's important to have proper hormone balance in order to have a robust immune system so that you reduce inflammation. Cortisol, for example, is quite anti-inflammatory. But again, if the cortisol is too high for too long, that starts to backfire because now the immune system is not functioning properly, and you just get more inflammation that way, right? And so it's important, again, to manage the stress. It's important to have the right stress response if there's a legit stress. But then as soon as that stressor is gone, we need to really bring the body back down to level ground, back to center, so that those stress responses don't continue, because your brain will keep remembering it if you don't literally shut that part down. So breathing, again, and meditation is how you shut that down. You allow the brain to really settle itself so it doesn't keep recalling the incident as if it's still happening. Because remember, your brain can't tell the difference, that it's in the past, right? Oh, this happened 10 years ago. My brain literally still thinks it's happening right now. So I have to literally work on that memory and make sure that I shut it down in my brain so that it's not on auto repeat. This is what makes us sick. So what are some symptoms that people may experience that might lead them to think that they have hormone imbalances induced by stress? Brain fog is a big one. Weight gain, fluid retention is another. You might see that with your routine blood work that your blood sugar is off. You might have high fasting blood sugar. You might have an increasing hemoglobin A1C as a sign that there's this chronically elevated blood sugar going on. Anxiety, irritability, premenstrual symptoms, sleep disturbances are another sign of hormone imbalances from stress. Sugar cravings or salt cravings are another. Hair thinning, dry hair, dry skin, low libido, and irregular menstrual cycles are also a sign that your hormones are out of balance due to stress. Fatigue is another big one. And this is where burnout comes in, right? So burnout is an exhaustion. It's a fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to resolve. No amount of eating right seems to resolve, right? And again, to get out of burnout, you've got to know your dynamic metabolic type. This helps to bring hormones back into balance because it helps you to know exactly what your specific needs are for the 4 pillars of wellness: eat, move, rest, and detox. Now, they all have to be functioning together because they're all interdependent. This is why sleep alone doesn't resolve burnout. This is why doing a cleanse by itself or doing intermittent fasting by itself is not going to resolve burnout. You have to get all 4 pillars up and running, right? If all you're doing is working on your nutrition, but you're only getting 5 hours of sleep, that's like, having only one table of a leg that's functioning and wondering why the table keeps falling over, right? You have to have all 4 pillars. They're interdependent. They're really critical to have up and functioning. And without the guesswork, you can know how to get those 4 pillars up and running if you know your dynamic metabolic type. So again, I encourage you to take our burnout assessment at awakenedwellnessnow.com. Let me know in the comments what your dynamic metabolic type is and what you're doing for your 4 pillars of wellness. Growth hormone is another really important hormone that is altered by stress. So high cortisol diminishes growth hormone or drops growth hormone. Growth hormone is really important for metabolism as well and mobilizing fat stores for proper weight maintenance. And so this is one of the reasons we start to get the belly fat with high cortisol. So our insulin is interrupted and growth hormone also contributes to basically destroying our metabolism, which is again another cause of burnout. It's the destruction of metabolism that leads to the burnout situation, right? If we're able to manage stress better, we will have much less burnout in this country, much less mental health issues as well. It's really the erosion from the chronic stress of the body's functions by way of metabolism, by way of destroying our metabolism, destroying our body's ability to make and use energy. You know, this is what stress does. It inhibits that, and then everything kind of topples from there. It's like a domino effect because your whole body is in fact connected. And so making sure that you're following your 4 pillars of wellness, applying your dynamic metabolic type, doing your breathing, meditation, these are all super, super important to make sure that no matter what's going on out there, what's going on in here is a whole other situation that's well balanced, harmonized, joyful. And storytelling is actually a really key factor we're beginning to see in studies. So we all love a good story, right? And it turns out that storytelling is not just for entertainment purposes, right? It's actually to structurally change the brain so that it behaves differently. If you can create a story about yourself that's positive, that you love, you essentially write a story. You're the main character of the story. Like literally sit down with a pen and a paper. Not quite like journaling. Journaling is kind of writing down what you experienced and how it made you feel. But this is more, I'm going to create the story of my life that I want to experience. This is my story, you know, and it's an uplifting, positive story. Right? I got up today and I felt amazing. I had great energy. You know, I met a friend, you know, for breakfast, and you know, I made an awesome, nutritious breakfast. Make sure that you detail and outline every sensory thing that has to do with waking up, making that breakfast. How did you feel? What does the food smell like? You know, how does the sun look when you look outside? How does that make you feel? How does the warmth of the sun on your face feel? You know, it has to be very, very sensory and emotional. So you want to be evoking joy and happiness, motivation, you know, feeling good, feeling joyful. You know, the food, how does it taste? What's the flavor? Right? And you want that all to be uplifting, you know, and a joyful experience, a very conscious experience of eating. And you're writing all of this down. And although it sounds like a long, tedious thing to do, your brain doesn't know the difference. And so you're writing the story down. It's very detailed. It's very emotional. I'm feeling, you know, happy. You know, the coffee, I love coffee. So, you know, I'm always smelling my espresso beans, and, you know, so what does that make you feel like? And then maybe you're going, you know, for a walk outside, right? And so again, the sun beaming on your face, you see a tree, you smell a flower, you know, all of these things you're essentially writing down as the story of your day, you know, from morning all the way through until you're putting your head down on the pillow and you're going to bed, right? And then you can elaborate on that story. It could be, this is my 3-month story. You know, this is not just one day in my life, but this is the next, you know, this is spring, the spring season, then the summer season, or this is the rest of my 2025, or my 5-year plan, my 10-year plan. But you're writing it down, and it's a very positive and uplifting story. You're the hero of your own story. right? So, and it's exactly what you desire and want. And writing down on the paper is literally structurally changing your brain. When you start to do that, your brain begins to actively look for the matches in your environment to the story that you have written down. We call that synchronicity, right? But we now have scientific evidence that the brain will literally start hyper-focusing, looking for the things that you wrote down on that piece of paper because it's now emotionally invested in finding that thing. And so there is a way that when you engage your heart in the story and the heart is commanding the brain will then be looking for the things that you wrote down on the paper. You know, so you'll be noticing the flowers more. You'll be more sensitive to the smell of coffee. You'll be more sensitive to the sun shining. You'll be able to pick up on the flower, see the flower. Those will stick out more to you because your brain will look for them and match them more than it will match the things that might make you annoyed in the morning, right? You basically block those out and you write the story as you want your life to unfold. And your brain will then seek those experiences out. So we're seeing that in studies. It's a real thing, and it's so exciting to know that, wow, I get to actually experience what I want because my brain actually cooperates with me and isn't necessarily working against me. Now, another really important tip is to consciously engage with your environment. So if it's social media, consciously engage with the social media. Make sure you're not doom scrolling. Make sure you're not going down rabbit holes with negative information and negative news. Again, not that we don't want to be informed, right? There's a delicate balance between knowing what's going on in the world and getting sucked into it, right? So it's important, yes, I want to be informed, but make sure that your news sources are positively informing you and not, fear-based. So be careful about those news organizations that want to sensationalize the news and to, instill fear by showing negative images, because those evoke emotions too that your brain cannot distinguish. So you want to make sure that you're getting at least 3 times more positive news than negative news, right? So a 3-to-1 ratio of positive versus negative. Make sure your news is solution-oriented. Don't listen to people that only talk about problems. Listen to those who have actual solutions that you can get behind, right? So make sure that you're curating your news sources appropriately. The people you hang around with are key. Make sure that you're hanging around with positive, uplifting people and minimizing those people that make you feel poorly. We do exchange energy with other people, and if we're not consciously interacting, we might end up in a bad mood. We don't even know what happened, right? And so you want to be very cautious that you are, interacting in a very conscious way with people. And so I hope those tips were useful for you. It's all about balancing hormones, being happy, and creating the life that we want, burnout free. And so if you enjoyed today's podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. Please, again, tell me in the comments, what is your dynamic metabolic type? How are you applying the 4 pillars of wellness? And what did you get out of this podcast that you find useful? If you have questions, let me know. Put them in the comments. I'm happy to answer questions in our next podcast. Anything that might not have been clear today or anything that you want to elaborate on, I'd love to answer questions. And so thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned. We'll be back next week. And until next time, many, many blessings.